Good evening, dear listener, and welcome to Audio Classic Detective, your home for refined mystery and masterful deduction. Here we revive the golden age of crime fiction where every motive is masked, every alibi tested, and only the keenest minds prevail. So settle in, brew a proper cup of tea, and prepare for clever crimes and even cleverer solutions. The investigation is about to begin. It was, in every way, an ordinary morning in St. Mary Mead. The cattle whistled softly. A gentle mist hung over the garden, and Miss Marple sat in her familiar armchair, knitting with quiet precision. The arrival of the post was never a particularly dramatic affair, usually a catalogue or a polite note from a distant niece. But today, nestled between the expected envelopes, was one quite out of the ordinary. Creamy paper, a bold crest embossed at the top, and a name that tugged at memory's edge. Lady Sylvia Harrow. Miss Marple's fingers paused, her knitting needles resting in her lap. Lady Sylvia, she recalled, had been something of a fixture in certain circles many years ago. A woman of wealth and some reputation, married into the Harrow family, whose name carried whispers of scandal even in its prime. The letter was an invitation, formal, polite, but with a curious urgency. Miss Marple was asked to attend an estate auction at Ashgrove Hall, where the family's famous silver collection was to be sold. A peculiar request, given that Miss Marple had little interest in auctions or silver collections. And yet, there was something in the phrasing, a hope that you might find it of interest, that hinted at more than simple hospitality. She set aside her knitting, folded the letter carefully, and knew, without quite knowing why, that she would go. A visit to the grocer's later that morning provided more than just a jar of marmalade. The moment Miss Marple mentioned her invitation to Ashgrove Hall, the shopkeeper's brow lifted, his hands hesitating over the scales. "Strange business, that," he muttered, half to himself. "The silver spoon, you know. Can't think why they'd want to stir all that up again." The silver spoon. The name rang faintly familiar, though its story had grown hazy with time. Miss Marple's polite inquiry was met with a glance toward the door, as though walls had ears. "Bad luck tied to that bit of silver, or so they say. Ever since—" He stopped himself. "Well, it's not my place." Later at the post office, the same cautious avoidance. The silver spoon had a reputation, it seemed, a whispered one, carried through village gossip but never quite spoken aloud. A tragedy, at a ball, a family shame, and the belief, half joked and half feared, that the spoon itself was cursed. Miss Marple smiled politely, offered no comment, and tucked each fragment away in the careful filing cabinet of her mind. She had learned long ago that the truth was never in the shouting, but in the silences. Ashgrove Hall was precisely the kind of house Miss Marple expected it to be. Grand in scale, but with the unmistakable air of decline that settled over old families with dwindling fortunes. The gravel drive was uneven, weeds pushing through cracks, and the ivy climbed a little too freely across the stone facade. Lady Sylvia greeted her at the door, her smile thin and brittle. Time had not been unkind to her, but it had left its fingerprints, a certain tightness around the mouth, a flicker of tension in her eyes. The household gathered awkwardly in the hall, a tableau of strained civility. There was Mr. Giles Harrow, stiff-backed and formal, his disapproval barely disguised. Beside him stood his wife, old jangling bracelets and nervous chatter. A younger man, a nephew perhaps, lounged carelessly in the corner, though his gaze was sharp and watchful. Even the staff lined up for polite introductions carried an air of apprehension, as though Miss Marple's arrival was not so much a guest's visit as the first act of an unpleasant play. She took it all in, faces, postures, fleeting glances, and tucked them into her quiet inventory. After all, houses spoke, and so did families. The silver collection was displayed in the drawing room, each piece gleaming beneath glass domes and polished oak cases, candlesticks, goblets, trays, each with its own tiny plaque, tracing generations of Harrow family history. It was the spoon that drew Miss Marple's attention. Smaller than she expected, ordinary in shape. But there was something about it, some weight in the way the butler's hand lingered as he dusted the case. Strange piece, that. The man said softly, as though the words escaped before he could stop them. Should have been melted down, if you ask me. After what happened. Miss Marple did not press. She merely observed. The slight tremor in his hand, the way Lady Sylvia's gaze snapped toward them, and the abrupt silence that followed. A story left unfinished, a shadow with edges blurred by time, and a spoon gleaming too brightly in its case, as though it remembered everything. The preview of the silver collection was meant to be a civil affair, the sort of event where polite conversation masked sharper intentions. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively near the corner, took in the room with her usual quiet curiosity. The heirs stood stiffly apart, their conversations clipped, each glance weighed with calculation or resentment. Collectors circled the cases with predatory interest, while a handful of village busybodies hovered, hungry for gossip. Among them was Mr. Giles Harrow, his thin mouth pressed into a line that suggested both disapproval and entitlement. His wife, draped in too many pearls, filled the silence with nervous chatter about provenance and family pride. The younger man, the nephew perhaps, made no effort to hide his boredom, though his restless fingers tapped ceaselessly on the edge of a display case. The silver spoon itself rested in a place of honor, or so it was meant to. Even now, Miss Marple noticed, some guests refused to look directly at it, as if the object might somehow look back. Moments before the auctioneer prepared to begin, a whisper swept the room. Low at first, then louder, swelling into panic. The silver spoon was gone. The velvet-lined case stood empty, the latch unfastened, though no one had seen it opened. Servants rushed about in confusion, heirs demanded explanations, and the auctioneer paled visibly, his hammer frozen mid-air. Lady Sylvia's hand trembled against her gown, her face drained of color. The room, already tense with unspoken histories, now seemed to vibrate with something darker, a sense that old ghosts had finally pushed through the cracks. Miss Marple, saying nothing, merely observed. Such moments were far more revealing than any confession. The way hands clenched, the gaps between questions and answers, the one person who seemed altogether too calm. Each was a thread, and Miss Marple had spent a lifetime learning how to follow threads. Lady Sylvia had endured many things: scandal, grief, the slow decay of family fortune. But the sight of that empty case seemed to unmake her entirely. She swayed where she stood, one hand reaching blindly for support, before crumpling to the floor as in a whisper of silk. Her collapse was so sudden, so absolute, that for a moment no one moved at all. It was too much for a missing spoon, Miss Marple thought, even for one so steeped in family history. There was fear in that collapse, not mere shock, but something closer to dread. As the butler helped her to a chair, Sylvia's lips moved faintly, but no sound emerged. Whatever words she meant to say remained locked inside her, and Miss Marple, with her keen ear for silence, understood that some truths weigh too heavily to be spoken aloud. The housekeeper, a woman with a face carved from worry itself, stood near the doorway, hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. Under her breath, just loud enough to reach Miss Marple's ear, came a singular remark. "The curse has returned." It was said not with drama, but with the resigned certainty of someone who had always believed it would. The staff, hearing the words, exchanged glances like passing notes in school, and a shiver seemed to pass through the room. Miss Marple did not believe in curses, but she believed in the way people spoke when fear had lived beside them too long. And fear, she noted, had made itself quite at home in Ashgrove Hall. While attention swirled around Lady Sylvia, Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the now empty display stand. Amid the flurry of panic and search parties, no one else seemed to notice the smudge of silver polish left behind on the velvet lining. It was a small thing, a careless fingerprint perhaps, but small things had a way of leading to larger truths. She tucked the observation away, saying nothing. After all, silver spoons do not vanish on their own, and whoever took it had left behind more than they realized. For all the tension that had gathered in the air, it was the absence of one woman that unsettled Miss Marple most of all. The maid who once served at Ashgrove Hall had been expected, her arrival quietly arranged in advance. She was to bring with her documents of provenance, evidence that would settle the story of the silver spoon once and for all. But she never came. No telegram, no explanation, simply vanished from her small lodging the night before her journey. The housekeeper's expression, when delivering the news, was carefully neutral, but her hands, Miss Marple noticed, gripped the edge of her apron, as though wringing out some unseen truth. It was not the first time someone connected to that fateful ball had disappeared without trace, and Miss Marple, who had long believed that absence speaks louder than presence, knew this was not a simple change of heart. The silence left by the missing maid was heavy with meaning, the kind that hovers only when too many people have agreed not to speak at once. Miss Marple's method was never to interrogate, only to ask gently and listen closely. Over the course of the afternoon she made her round of conversations, a knitting bag in hand, and a polite smile firmly in place. She spoke first to the grocer's wife, who remembered the maid as a quiet girl with a pretty smile and unfortunate luck with gentlemen callers. Then to old Mrs. Willoughby, who once worked alongside her in the kitchens and swore the girl was no thief, no matter what anyone said. At the village inn, where memories lingered longer than guests, the story became more tangled. The maid had left Ashgrove Hall abruptly, so the tale went, after a terrible misunderstanding involving silver going missing and a whispered accusation of theft. But no one could agree who made the accusation or why the girl had disappeared before she could defend herself. Each memory was part truth, part invention, and Miss Marple, sifting through them with quiet patience, began to see the outline of something darker beneath the dust of time. It was at the churchyard gate, where two elderly sisters paused to chat, that the conversation took its first real turn toward scandal. "Pretty little thing," one of them said, "and entirely too friendly with. Well, you know." The other gave a pointed cough, but Miss Marple's silence, always her most effective tool, drew the story out like thread through fabric. There had been a romance, hurried and hushed, between the maid and a member of the Harrow family. "A foolish girl," one sister tutted, "should have known her place." But Miss Marple knew better than to blame the girl alone. In her long experience, scandals were rarely the fault of one person, and the weight of consequence, more often than not, fell unevenly. It was a dangerous entanglement, and when it ended, as it inevitably did, the maid disappeared for good, taking with her the beginnings of a secret too large to bury completely. That night, as Miss Marple settled into her room, a faint rustle beneath her door caught her attention. A single envelope, with no name, no stamp, just a folded sheet of paper inside. Some secrets are best left buried. Leave Ashgrove whole while you still can. The handwriting was oddly childish, the ink slightly smudged, but it was the smell of polish clinging to the paper that caught her attention, the same scent that had clung to the display cases that morning. Miss Marple placed the letter beside her teacup, her expression unchanged. Threats, after all, were only truly frightening when delivered by someone clever enough not to leave fingerprints. The letter did not unsettle her. If anything, it clarified her thinking. Over the course of her gentle questioning, there had been a passing remark, something almost thrown away, that now returned with perfect clarity. Of course, the girl wasn't even supposed to be at the silver ball. One villager had said, servants never were. And yet, there she had been, in the wrong place, at the wrong time, witness to something she was never meant to see. It was not the spoon that was cursed, Miss Marple realized, but the truth it held, a truth so dangerous that those who glimpsed it had been vanishing ever since. Lady Sylvia's voice was steady, her hands folded neatly in her lap. It was, Miss Marple thought, a story told too many times, polished through years of repetition, until only the safe edges remained. It was a tragic accident. Lady Sylvia explained. Her grand silver ball, held to mark a family anniversary, had ended in unspeakable misfortune. A guest had stumbled at the top of the main staircase, falling to her death before the assembled company. The silver spoon, part of the evening's themed entertainment, had somehow ended up in the victim's hand, and from that moment onwards, its name and its legend were sealed. Lady Sylvia's words were measured, but Miss Marple detected the faintest tremor at certain moments, when the name of the guest was spoken, when describing the position of the body, when asked exactly who had found her first. It was a story rehearsed to perfection, but Miss Marple knew the truth was often found not in the tale itself, but in the moments carefully left out. Later, in quieter corners of the house, Miss Marple asked the same questions, but to different ears. Mr. Giles Harrow, for one, remembered the bowl less fondly than Lady Sylvia. The whole evening was a mistake, he said bluntly. That engagement should never have been announced. A broken engagement, it seemed, between the victim and a Harrow son, though which son depended on who was telling the story. Some said it was Lady Sylvia's own husband, others the younger brother, but all agreed on one point. There had been another man involved. Miss Marple listened with polite detachment, knitting slowly though her mind worked far faster. 2 suitors, 1 woman, a shattered engagement, and a fatal fall. These were not accidents of fate. These were the ingredients of motive. It was in the servants' hall that the story shifted from tragedy to legend. A former parlour-maid, now stooped with age, whispered to Miss Marple a story passed down through the staff, that the dying woman had clutched the silver spoon in her final moments, not as a relic, but as a message. With her last trembling strength, she had scratched something onto the spoon's surface. A name, perhaps, or initials. A dying attempt to identify her killer. The message was said to be faint, only visible under the right light, and only if one knew where to look. Yet somehow, before the spoon could be examined, it had vanished, only to reappear later, cleaned, polished, and perfectly innocent once more. It was a story too wild to believe, Miss Marple thought, except in houses like this, where truth was often far stranger than invention. As Miss Marple pieced these stories together, small inconsistencies began to surface. The precise time of the fall shifted slightly depending on the teller. Some swore it was before the first dance. Others insisted it was well after midnight. The broken engagement so freely mentioned was curiously absent from Lady Sylvia's version. And most curious of all, when Miss Marple mentioned the silver spoon's message, there was no reaction at all, as though the very idea had been scrubbed from memory. It was the kind of silence Miss Marple recognized, the silence of a family that had agreed, long ago, to forget certain things entirely. Throughout her gentle inquiries, Miss Marple was aware of another presence, not a ghost, but a pair of living eyes. Someone, one of the family, watched her with careful interest. Not obvious, never lingering too long, but present enough that Miss Marple felt the weight of it, like a cat observing a bird at the window. Whoever they were, they had understood immediately why Miss Marple was here, and they were afraid. Thea, Miss Marple knew, was a marvelous teacher. It revealed things no amount of questioning ever could. The hush of early morning was broken, not by the gentle clatter of breakfast being laid or the murmur of servants at work, but by a single piercing cry. Colonel Harrow was found slumped in the library chair, his body oddly twisted, his hand clenching something so tightly his knuckles stood white. A polished silver fork, not a spoon, a fork. His face, once so ruddy and full of life, was now ashen, the rigid mask of a man who had faced a final and unexpected reckoning. The fork's tines glinted coldly, reflecting the first gray light filtering through the window. There was no blood, no immediate sign of violence, only the unnatural stillness of a man caught between shock and death. The housekeeper crossed herself. Lady Sylvia swayed against the doorframe, and a footman turned away, suddenly pale. But it was not the body that held Miss Marple's attention. It was the fork, a strange, deliberate object, chosen with intent. And in Miss Marple's quiet mind, questions already began to form. The news spread through Ashgrove Hall like a fire through dry grass. Voices rose, sharp with accusation and fear. Lady Sylvia's hands fluttered helplessly at her throat, while Mr. Giles demanded to know who had last seen his brother alive. The younger members of the family, those too young to truly remember the silver bowl, were quick to assign blame, while the older ones withdrew into silence, eyes flickering with memory and guilt. Even the servants were drawn into the fray, who had locked the library door, who had carried in the drinks, who had seen the colonel retire for the night. Through it all, Miss Marple said nothing, her knitting lying untouched in her lap. It was not the shouting that interested her. It was the gaps between accusations, the uneven tremor in certain voices, and the way one or two faces seemed almost relieved. Grief, in her long experience, rarely came dressed in chaos. But guilt, it thrived in moments like these. Amid the noise, Miss Marple's attention drifted back to that curious silver fork, polished to such a shine that it seemed hardly touched by ordinary life. The silver spoon, the very object at the heart of the family's legend, was still missing. So why, Miss Marple wondered, had the murderer chosen a fork? It was not a weapon of convenience, nor one chosen in panic. This was deliberate, symbolic even, and symbolism, Miss Marple knew, reveals the mind of the killer far more than the weapon itself. The fork was a message, but its meaning was not yet clear. What was clear was this: the answer lay in the family's own history, and whoever killed the colonel knew exactly which ghosts they meant to awaken. It took less than an hour for suspicion to settle like dust on the younger Harrow brother. Their quarrel over inheritance was well known, a bitter feud fought in whispers and legal papers, punctuated by long silences at family dinners. "He had everything I was entitled to," the younger brother muttered darkly, "and he knew it." It was the obvious conclusion, and in Miss Marple's experience, obvious conclusions were often entirely wrong. While the family argued and the police began their methodical questioning, Miss Marple drifted quietly along the edges of the room. There, near the side table, her sharp eyes caught something subtle but revealing. A faint smear of wax polish, disturbed by a footprint. Not the kind left by a man like the younger brother, who wore heavier shoes, but something smaller, lighter, and altogether less expected. She said nothing. Not yet. Some clues were best left to ripen. Later, as the household began to recede into silence, Miss Marple returned to the library alone. There, caught on the edge of the side table, was a tiny fragment of cloth, torn and barely visible. A thread from a sleeve or a glove, too fine to belong to the younger brother. She tucked it into her handkerchief, her expression betraying neither triumph nor surprise. Some mysteries, after all, begin with a missing spoon, but others are solved by a thread no one noticed at all. Miss Marple had long believed that people spoke most clearly when they said nothing at all. It was in the language of hands and faces, the quiet betrayals of nerves, that truth so often emerged. She sat quietly at the breakfast table the morning after the murder, her tea cooling beside her, her knitting untouched. Across the room, Lady Sylvia's teacup rattled softly against its saucer, her fingers trembling despite the studied poise of her expression. Mr. Giles, by contrast, kept his hands buried deep in his pockets, though his cuff-link, one of the old family set, had been clumsily fastened, as though in haste or distraction. The younger nephew avoided eye contact altogether, his gaze fixed on some invisible point just beyond the window, but his fingers tapped a restless rhythm against the arm of his chair, a beat faster than his usual calm demeanor suggested. Even the butler, ever the model of discretion, stood with his shoulders too rigid, his eyes darting briefly toward the library door every time someone mentioned the colonel's name. Miss Marple made no notes. She did not need to. Every tremor, every glance, every restless hand had already been tucked into her mind, a collection of small betrayals, far more telling than any confession. When the police began their formal questioning, the family offered alibis almost too smoothly, as though rehearsed in the long hours of the night. Lady Sylvia had retired early, so she said, after taking her customary sleeping draught, one she had, conveniently, mentioned to two separate housemates. Mr. Giles had been in his study, drafting a letter to his solicitor, a letter which, naturally, had already been neatly left on his desk, undated, but ready to produce if needed. Miss Marple listened politely, her hands folded in her lap, but beneath her placid smile lay a quiet doubt. Alibis were rarely so neat, and these two, delivered with matching precision, fit together almost too comfortably. It was not proof of guilt, of course. Not yet. But Miss Marple knew from long experience that truth rarely arrives so well dressed. It was only later, when Miss Marple asked gently probing questions, that the real inconsistencies began to surface. The housekeeper, a woman with the air of someone carrying too many secrets for too many years, spoke of her whereabouts that night, first in the linen cupboard preparing fresh sheets, then assisting Lady Sylvia's maid, and finally retiring to her own quarters shortly after 11. It was a tidy account, except for one small inconvenience. The maid, when asked, insisted that the housekeeper had never come near her that night. The butler, too, had seen her near the library, long after midnight, a time she carefully omitted from her own version. Miss Marple made no accusation. She merely smiled, thanked the housekeeper for her time, and added another small inconsistency to her growing catalogue, a hole in time, waiting to be filled. It was a passing remark from one of the older servants, said almost in jest, that opened an entirely new door. "It's always the silver," the woman said as she polished the cutlery tray. "Ever since that girl ran off." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "What girl was that?" she asked softly. The servant hesitated, caught between caution and the need to share. "One of the maids, years ago. Pretty thing. Got herself tangled up with one of the young masters. No good ever comes of that, does it? The romance had ended badly, of course. Promises made and broken, whispered arguments in back corridors, and finally, a disappearance. The girl leaving the house one night without a word, never to return. The silver spoon," Miss Marple reflected, "was no cursed object. It was merely a witness, one that had survived when others had not." The soft chime of the hall clock marked midnight when Miss Marple stirred awake. It was not sound that had woken her, but rather a quiet sense of being watched, an instinct sharpened by years of quiet observation. By the soft glow of her bedside candle she saw it. Resting neatly beside her spectacles was the missing silver spoon. It had been placed there deliberately, not tossed or forgotten, but positioned with intention, as though it had been left for her eyes alone. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her fingers hovered above the spoon for a long moment before she picked it up. The silver was cold to the touch, yet faintly smudged, as though recently handled with trembling hands. There was something almost ceremonial about it, a gift offered, or a burden passed. Someone within Ashgrove Hall had chosen Miss Marple to receive it, and that, she knew, was the kind of trust born, not from fondness, but from desperation. Turning the spoon in her hand, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught something new, a glint where there should have been none. There on the polished surface was a fresh engraving, not the crest of the Harrow family, nor the hall's official mark, but a date carved with careful, deliberate strokes. The date belonged to a night long past, the night of the silver-themed ball. Beneath the date were initials, scrawled in a hand that trembled, the very initials of the vanished maid. Miss Marple's thumb traced the letters, her mind drifting back to the whispers in the village, the half-told stories, the uneasy silence whenever the maid's name was mentioned. This was no ordinary message. It was a voice from the past, speaking at last, not through words, but through the very silver that had borne witness to everything. By morning the news had spread through the house like a draught under a closed door. The spoon had returned, they said. Of its own accord, some claimed, appearing like a ghost's calling card. The curse, long whispered but never admitted aloud, was awake once more. The housekeeper's hands shook as she poured the morning tea, her mouth muttering a half-remembered prayer. The younger Harrow nephew refused to touch his breakfast, his eyes flicking constantly toward the library, as though expecting his uncle's ghost to appear. Lady Sylvia sat perfectly still, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the color in her cheeks strangely absent, even as she forced a smile. Fear has its own language, Miss Marple knew, and in Ashgrove Hall, fear spoke fluently now. While others clutched at superstition, Miss Marple focused instead on the quiet facts. The spoon had not walked into her room alone. Someone had placed it there. But who? And why? Was it a warning meant to drive her away? A confession offered by a conscience unable to bear its weight? Or perhaps it was something even more fragile, a plea for help left by someone too frightened to speak aloud. Whoever had placed the spoon beside her bed knew precisely what it meant, and Miss Marple suspected. They knew she would understand. Later that morning, as she sat quietly in the corner of the drawing room, Miss Marple turned the spoon over once more. The date, the initials, the night everything began. There was no separating the silver spoon from the tragedy it witnessed. The maid, the lover, the fall, the broken engagement. All of it led back to this one piece of silver, its surface now engraved not just with letters but with guilt, fear, and silence kept too long. In Ashgrove Hole, Miss Marple realized the past did not sleep quietly beneath the soil. It had merely been waiting, and now, at last, it was demanding payment in full. The housekeeper's room was small, orderly, and quietly resigned to its purpose. A room meant for someone who had spent a lifetime in service, storing secrets alongside linens and silver polish. She stood by the window, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. For a long moment she said nothing at all. Miss Marple, patient as ever, simply folded her hands in her lap and waited, allowing silence to do what questions could not. At last the housekeeper drew a long breath, as though the words themselves had weight. "I should have spoken years ago, Miss Marple, but speaking can be dangerous in a house like this." What followed was not so much a confession as a burden laid down at last. The original silver spoon, she explained, had carried far more than its family crest. It had held a secret that began with a dying woman's desperate act, and ended with a truth so dangerous it had to be hidden at any cost. She had kept that truth locked in silence, believing the past would stay buried. But now, with two dead, and fear seeping through the very walls, silence was no longer a comfort. It was a curse of its own. The story, as the housekeeper told it, was almost too incredible to believe. And yet, Miss Marple knew at once that it was true. On the night of the silver-themed ball, in the moments between life and death, the victim, a young woman whose name no longer appeared in polite conversation, had clutched the silver spoon with trembling fingers. With her final breath, or perhaps a single splintered nail, she had scratched something onto its surface, a message. Not a full explanation, but a name, or perhaps just initials, a desperate whisper preserved in silver. The housekeeper's voice faltered. "It was there, plain as day, when I saw it, and I knew." She broke off, but Miss Marple's mind filled the gap. She had known that the truth, if revealed, would destroy the family she served. And so, the spoon had to be silenced too. What happened next had the simplicity of true scandal. No grand conspiracy, just fear, panic, and self-preservation at work. While the house was still reeling from the tragedy, while guests murmured in shocked clusters and the body lay in its silken shroud, the spoon was quietly removed. The housekeeper herself had carried it away, slipping it into her apron pocket, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it twice. In its place, she left a perfect replica, polished, identical, but utterly innocent. The original, with its dangerous message, was meant to be destroyed, melted down into silence. But something went wrong. By morning, the spoon, and the only person who might have seen the switch, had both vanished. The truth had not been buried after all. It had simply waited, biding its time in silver. It was the maid, the girl who had once dared to love above her station, who disappeared that night. The housekeeper had never believed in coincidences, and neither did Miss Marple. The girl had seen something, or understood more than she should have. Perhaps she had found the real spoon. Perhaps she had taken it with her. Perhaps she knew it was her only protection. And so the girl fled into darkness, taking with her the truth the family could not bear to face. The housekeeper's voice dropped to a whisper. She knew too much, and in this house, knowing too much has always been dangerous. Miss Marple rose, offering her thanks with gentle formality, as though the housekeeper had merely served a particularly good cup of tea. But beneath her mild expression lay a sharpened certainty. This was the story she had been waiting for. As she turned toward the door, a floorboard creaked softly in the corridor. Someone had been listening. Miss Marple said nothing, merely adjusted her shawl, and stepped into the hall. Whoever had stood there had already vanished into the shadows, but their fear lingered in the air, like perfume, long after the wearer is gone. It was not fear of what Miss Marple knew. It was fear of what she would now begin to understand. The housekeeper's knock was hesitant, a knock that carried news she would rather not deliver. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and followed her to the hall, where a figure stood just inside the threshold. The woman's coat was worn but carefully mended, her gloves neat despite the frayed cuffs. But it was her face that held Miss Marple's attention. The features were younger, sharper, but unmistakably cut from the same cloth as the vanished maid. There was a family likeness no amount of time could erase. The woman introduced herself with a quiet determination, though her voice trembled slightly at the edges. She had come, she said, because the past no longer allowed her to stay away. I believe, she said, that you knew my mother. She was a maid here long ago, and I believe she left behind something that could clear her name. Her gaze settled not on Miss Marple, but on the silver spoon resting on a side table, as though it had been waiting for her arrival. The story poured out, halting at first, then faster, as though the weight of silence had become too much to bear. Her mother had vanished the night of the silver-themed ball, leaving behind only a single fearful letter, written in hurried, uneven hand. In it, she spoke of witnessing something she was never meant to see, and of the silver spoon, which she believed held the proof that could protect her or condemn her forever. For years, the daughter explained, she had pieced together fragments of rumor and half-truths. The broken engagement, the fatal fall, the whispered scandal that no one dared speak of directly. All of it seemed to circle back to that single night and that single spoon. And now, she said softly, it's here. Back in this house. I need to know what it says. Because if my mother was innocent, then it's time the world knew. If the arrival of the woman unsettled the house, her claim tore through it like a blade through silk. Lady Sylvia's already pale face lost the last traces of color, her hands clenching the arms of her chair, as though gripping the earth itself. Mr. Giles rose, voice trembling with fury, demanding to know who had invited her, and what proof she had to make such a scandalous accusation. The younger nephew, always restless, paced the room, offering a series of denials so forceful they rang hollow even to his own ears. The housekeeper stood frozen in the doorway, her mouth opening once, then shutting again without a word. It was not guilt or innocence the family argued about now. It was fear, the fear that a forgotten witness had returned, and with her, the truth they had buried so carefully. Through it all, Miss Marple sat quietly, her hands folded, her knitting untouched in her lap. She watched, not the visitor, but the reactions her presence provoked. Who turned away too quickly? Who spoke first? Who needed to be seen as indignant? And who stood back, saying nothing at all? It was not just the daughter who had returned. It was the past itself, walking back through the door in plain sight. And Miss Marple knew that the truth had already been told, not in words but in glances, tremors, and the silence that followed certain names. People she had always believed were rather like silver themselves. Some polished their stories until nothing true remained, while others allowed tarnish to hide the shine beneath. But under the right light, every flaw, every scratched truth could be seen. And the light, Miss Marple thought, was growing very bright indeed. Absolutely. Here's the AI voiceover ready script for Chapter 10. The second murder, crafted seamlessly from the provided subheadings, maintaining the classic Miss Marple style. Elegant, unsettling, and psychologically layered. The housekeeper's door stood slightly ajar, and within, the room was unnaturally still. The air held that peculiar weight found only in rooms where life has abruptly left. The woman lay across her narrow bed, her hands curled into fists, her face twisted not in surprise, but in the bitter recognition of what she had always feared. Forced into her throat, lodged cruelly in the final grimace of her mouth, was a polished silver napkin ring, its surface gleaming, as though freshly wiped. Miss Marple stood at the threshold, her eyes taking in not only the body, but the silence that surrounded it. No struggle had been heard, no cry for help. The killer had come with a dreadful calmness, knowing exactly what they meant to do. And why? The choice of weapon was no accident. This was not blind violence, but something far colder. A message, carved not in words but in silver. It was not the first silver object to bear witness, Miss Marple reflected. First the spoon, now the napkin ring, each piece part of the house's treasured collection, transformed into a symbol of death. In a house where silver had always stood for wealth, pride, and legacy, it had now become a signature, a calling card left not for the police, but for the family itself. Each object carried the weight of history, and the killer knew it. This was someone who understood that, in Ashgrove Hall, silver was never just silver. It was memory, it was guilt, it was a witness that could not lie. Miss Marple's fingers rested briefly on the napkin ring, feeling its smoothness. The housekeeper had been silenced, but the silver, ironically, had found its voice. By the time the family gathered, panic was thick in the air, each voice raised a little too high, each theory a little too wild. "It's madness, surely," cried one of the younger heirs, "a lunatic obsessed with the silver curse." But Miss Marple knew better. Madness was rarely so tidy, and obsession rarely so purposeful. This was not the work of a mind unraveled. This was the work of a mind determined. The housekeeper's death was not a spontaneous act, but a deliberate silencing, a calculated removal of someone who had known too much for too long. The killer's hand had been forced, but not by madness, by fear. And fear, Miss Marple knew, was the most logical motive of all. In the stillness after the household's uproar, Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting resting untouched beside her. The housekeeper's confession, given only hours before, was no longer a mere story. It was the trigger that had sealed her fate. She had unlocked a door someone desperately needed to keep closed, and once that door had opened, there had been only one way to ensure it closed again. Secrets, Miss Marple thought, had their own terrible gravity, And in Ashgrove Hall, that weight was finally proving too much to bear. 2 deaths, both linked not just to the family, but to the silver itself. First a fork, then a napkin ring, and beneath it all, the shadow of the missing spoon, still exerting its hold after all these years. The pattern was clear. The killer was not merely hiding a crime. They were rewriting the family's history in blood and silver, making sure that the truth would never find its way into the light. But silver, Miss Marple knew, had a curious quality. No matter how often it was polished, the past always left a trace. The household was summoned to the drawing room, the summons issued not by the police, but by Miss Marple herself. There was no refusal, no polite evasion. There was something in her quiet authority that made attendance compulsory. The family gathered, tense, restless, and deeply uncomfortable, as though each had already sensed that the past was about to speak aloud. Lady Sylvia sat closest to the fire, her hands trembling faintly against the armrests. Mr. Giles hovered near the sideboard, his posture too stiff, his eyes fixed on nothing at all. The younger nephew stood apart, his fingers tugging at a loose thread on his cuff, while the remaining staff lingered near the door, reluctant witnesses to a reckoning long overdue. Miss Marple took her seat, not at the head of the room but precisely where she could see them all at once. Her knitting lay untouched in her lap. Today her hands would remain still. "I think," she began, her voice mild as ever, "that it is time we untangle exactly what happened here. Not just last night, but many years ago." Miss Marple's voice was calm, without accusation, yet her words laid bare the bones of the past. "The silver-themed ball," she said, "was meant to be a celebration, a tribute to family tradition. But behind the music and the dancing there was something altogether uglier, unfolding. With quiet precision she reconstructed the night, the broken engagement, the whispers between 2 lovers forced apart, the confrontation in the library, and finally, the fatal fall down the grand staircase. It had never been an accident. The victim was pushed, deliberately and with intent. And in those final moments, knowing life was slipping away, she had grasped the nearest object, the silver spoon, and used it not as a weapon, but as a witness. "Murder, you see," Miss Marple said softly, "has a way of leaving its fingerprints, even when the hands themselves are long gone. It was the spoon that had held the secret all along." Miss Marple explained how, with a broken fingernail, or perhaps a sliver of shattered glass, the dying woman had scratched a message into the silver, a final act of courage and clarity, naming the one who had pushed her to her death. For years the spoon had been dismissed as a family relic, a mere ornament among many. But it had always been something far more dangerous, a piece of silver that refused to forget. When the maid disappeared that same night, it was because she knew what the spoon carried, and someone within these very walls, had spent every moment since ensuring that neither the spoon nor the truth it held would ever see the light of day. It was a simple act of substitution that set the entire chain of tragedy into motion. The real spoon, the one with the damning message, was quietly removed. In its place, a perfect replica was left behind, a spoon identical in weight and polish, but utterly empty of truth. But truth, Miss Marple reflected, is not so easily erased. The maid had seen the switch, or perhaps even held the true spoon herself, and so she too had to disappear. From that night forward, the house had lived under the shadow of its own deception, each new generation inheriting not just the silver collection, but the buried guilt attached to it. Miss Marple's voice did not rise. She made no dramatic gesture. Instead, she spoke the name with the quiet certainty of one who has simply tidied up a puzzle, all the pieces falling into place at last. It was Mr. Giles, the elder brother, whose engagement had been broken when his fiancée fell in love with someone beneath her station. In a fit of pride, jealousy, and desperation, he had confronted her that night, and in a single push, ended her life, and ensured his own ruin, if ever the truth came to light. The maid, a silent witness, had fled with the proof in her hands, and from that night until this very moment, Mr. Giles had been a man haunted by silver, willing to kill again and again to keep one small spoon from speaking aloud. Miss Marple folded her hands once more, and the silence that followed was absolute. For years the story of the missing maid had been told in half-truths and convenient omissions, a whispered scandal, softened into the tale of a thief who vanished into the night. But Miss Marple, with her unerring sense for human nature, knew better. The girl was no thief. She had been a scapegoat, her disappearance a necessary sacrifice to protect a crime that reached far higher up the household ladder. The real theft, Miss Marple explained, was not silver or jewels, but the truth itself, a truth so dangerous that allowing it into daylight would have shattered the Harrow family's carefully maintained facade. The maid had seen too much. She had glimpsed the quarrel, the fatal push, and most damning of all, she had found the spoon, the one object that held the dying woman's silent accusation. She had not run to escape justice, but to escape becoming its next victim. The real tragedy of the silver-themed ball had nothing to do with cursed silver or superstition. It had been a far simpler tale, the kind of story Miss Marple had seen in villages, drawing rooms, and country inns countless times before. Lady Sylvia's first husband, handsome, charming, and dangerously possessive, had discovered his lover's affection for another man, a man considered beneath her station, yet one to whom her heart belonged. What followed was no planned murder, but a quarrel turned fatal, a shove at the top of the staircase, a moment of blind rage that ended in a life cut short on the marble floor below. Panic had followed, not just for the husband but for everyone who stood to lose if the truth came to light. And so they buried it, not with lies, but with silence, trusting time to smooth the edges of memory. But time, Miss Marple knew, was never so obliging. The silver spoon had never been just a relic of the family's collection. In those final moments, the dying woman had grasped it, clutching at anything within reach to leave behind a message that could not be ignored. With either a splintered fingernail or a fragment of shattered glass, she had scratched into the soft silver the initials of her killer. It was not a confession, but a final breath transformed into a clue, a voice in silver that would outlast any whispered alibi. That message, those simple two initials, held the power to undo everything. And so, the spoon had become the family's most dangerous possession, a treasure hidden not for its value, but for its truth. In trying to bury it, the family had only ensured that its shadow would follow them, down the generations, through every carefully curated story, until the past could no longer be contained. The twist Miss Marple revealed next was the most painful of all, for it was Lady Sylvia herself who had ensured the spoon's disappearance. Not because she had committed the crime, but because she had spent a lifetime atoning for it, protecting her husband, her family, and the legacy that bore their name. It was guilt, not greed, that had driven her. The guilt of knowing, and the guilt of choosing silence over justice. In her mind, the spoon was not evidence, but a ghost, one she tried to banish by hiding it away. But guilt like silver, cannot be polished into oblivion. It lingers, waiting to be found once more. The final murders, the colonel, the housekeeper, had been born not out of the original crime but out of a fatal misunderstanding. The modern heir, raised on half-truths and family gossip, had come to believe the original spoon still held the damning message. Believing their entire inheritance was under threat, they had killed to protect it, never realizing that the original spoon had been swapped decades before. They were guarding a phantom, committing murder to silence a secret already erased. In trying to protect the family legacy, they had become the very danger the family feared most. Later, as Miss Marple prepared to leave Ashgrove Hall, she allowed herself a quiet moment of reflection. Secrets, she thought, were curious things. They could be hidden in silver or buried in silence. But they always had weight, and sooner or later that weight must be carried. In Ashgrove Hall, the price of silence had been paid, in fear, in guilt, and in blood. And the silver spoon, once just a pretty object on a velvet cushion, had proved itself far heavier than anyone ever imagined. There's something quite extraordinary about the weight of secrets, isn't there? In the end, it wasn't the silver spoon itself that caused so much tragedy, but the fear of what it might reveal. Every character in this story carried their own hidden guilt, each choice shaped by a desperate need to protect the past. And yet, the past has a way of slipping through even the smallest cracks, no matter how tightly you try to seal them. Miss Marple, with her gentle smile and her deceptively sharp mind, understands this better than anyone. She knows that human nature leaves fingerprints far more permanent than any object ever could. And in the quiet corners of Ashgrove Hall, it wasn't the polished silver that spoke the loudest, but the trembling hands, the nervous glances, and the silences that stretched just a second too long. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? In families like the Harrows, or perhaps even in your own, what stories lie quietly tarnished beneath years of polish? And that concludes today's journey into the shadows of mystery and deduction. What did you think of this case? Did you see the twist coming, or did it catch you by surprise? Share your theories and favorite moments in the comments below. Love to hear your take. And if you're craving more thrilling detective tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. Until then, stay curious. The next clue might be closer than you think.